Hello and welcome to Political Thinking. This week, coming from self-isolation. We'll be back in studio soon. If Boris Johnson does fall, if he's forced out of office by his own MPs, people will say, history will no doubt record, that he had to go because he broke the rules which he had set. The truth will be a little more complicated, as my guest on Political Thinking will spell out, I think. It will be because many Conservatives think that Boris Johnson has stopped being a Conservative, that those very COVID rules, those limitations on freedom, that extra spending, that higher tax, all represents a change that they don't want to see. Steve Baker was a thorn in the flesh of Theresa May when he ran the ERG, the European Research Group. He's become a thorn in the flesh of Boris Johnson as one of the leaders of the CRG, the COVID Recovery Group, which has opposed the lockdowns, the restrictions, the compulsory vaccines, the compulsory masks, and all the rest of it. Last time we spoke on Political Thinking 3 years ago, he told me that his job was to herd the tigers. So which way will he herd them now? Steve Baker, welcome back to Political Thinking.
Well, Nick, thank you very much indeed for having me on and giving me that terrifying introduction. I was very nervous on the first one we did, and I'm slightly worried about what you'll ask me this time, but the last podcast was a great success, so thank you for it, and thank you to everybody who's listened to it.
Well, last time we spoke, a month later, Theresa May fell. She was toppled. Here we are again.
Yeah, it's a sorry situation we're in. I'm appalled that we've reached this position. We didn't make Boris Johnson Prime Minister for his meticulous grasp of tedious rules. But this is appalling and the public are rightly furious. So at the moment, I'm afraid it does look like checkmate, but whether he can save himself, we'll see.
Checkmate? Yeah,
I feel a bit like we're all looking at the chessboard and you know how it goes. You check, checkmate, and then people are all looking at the board unless they're grandmasters and saying, well, is it over? And I think that's sort of where we are. It probably is checkmate, and we're all waiting for Sue Gray's report at the moment.
But you think, in other words, far from saving him, that might be the end of the Prime Minister?
Look, I'm very clear that I won't allow myself to substitute politics where law and ethics should be. So if the Prime Minister lied at the dispatch box, if the Prime Minister broke the law, if the Prime Minister positively acquiesced in the breaking of law, then he simply must go. I think if we'd reached a set of circumstances like this with a chief executive of a company or a major leader of a public institution subject to select committee scrutiny, I honestly don't think they'd be in post by now. But we're in an extraordinary set of circumstances with the Prime Minister, and particularly with the Prime Minister being pursued, hounded out of office, I think, by probably by a former disgruntled employee. That creates an extraordinary set of circumstances, and here we are. So, we're looking forward to Sue Gray's report. We'll take a judgment after that.
You say he's being harried out of office by, I assume you mean Dominic Cummings, a man you fell out with. We may come to that a little bit later. But if you made up your mind that you will, if the report is as you fear it is, trigger a vote of no confidence, you'll put a letter in and then you'll vote against him.
Well, so I'm very clear that if he's broken the law or lied at the dispatch box, then he must go, and so I would then act myself to that end. But I would just say, as I said before, I would much prefer that Boris Johnson was a roaring success, but that is not where we currently are. One thing I would say, I'm not going to organise against Boris Johnson. My heart wouldn't be in it. And having been down that road once before, I really don't want to go down it again. So, I won't be organising against him, no.
Why not? Because, as you say, when Theresa May was in trouble, when you were criticising the sort of Brexit deal you did then say you were herding the tigers, to use your phrase to me 3 years ago. Why isn't now the moment for Steve Baker to herd the tigers and say, we've got to get rid of him?
I suppose to respect your listeners, I'll give the true answer. The true answer is we're all only human. And to stand in the midst of such a maelstrom where you're trying to remove a Prime Minister is a great and terrible experience. And it just doesn't have to be me every time. It just doesn't. I am a backbench member of Parliament. I have one vote in a leadership confidence vote, like I do in the House of Commons. And, I am not under a duty to be the leader of every insurrection. And I don't especially enjoy the conflict. I've done it once before. And really, honestly, at the moment, I'm looking to the Cabinet for leadership. We're talking about alleged serious breaches of the ministerial code, possibly the law, possibly the Nolan principles of public life. And really, there are some proper grown-ups who are supposed to be leaders of our country in the Cabinet. I would quite like them to rise to this moment, I am a humble backbencher. I don't have any power in these matters apart from my one vote.
And what do you say to those people who say in the end this should be about a political calculus? You should be working out whether removing Boris Johnson is right for your sort of conservatism or indeed for the Conservative Party and its chances of winning an election.
One of the things that is wrong with politics and has been wrong for a long time, one of the things which I think corrupts democracy, is where people don't take seriously the set of rules that we're under an obligation to follow. So, for example, the Nolan principles. We should, in a nutshell, be first doing what is right. So this is why I do recognise that some people put the political calculation ahead of the law and the ethics. But actually, in a situation like this, I'm not willing to. The law comes first, the ministerial code, as it were, second, because it's not actually law, and then other moral considerations. But if in the end this is a political decision, then I'll make a political calculation. But I think it will be first and foremost not a political question. Not everything's politics, right?
Now, perhaps what you've just said is what explains why you have been a leader of one rebellion and one group on Brexit, one of the leaders of the COVID recovery group, now the leader of the Conservative Way Forward, a Thatcherite group, that you do talk as if politics is always about principle, is rarely about compromise.
Well, no.
Do you think that's right?
No, politics has always got to be about compromise. I think if you only had people in politics with a radical zeal that could never know compromise, you'd just constantly have a series of revolutions. So, I am willing to compromise. And of course, on the big issues where I've taken a stand, I can see why people would say it was uncompromising. But that's because I've taken a stand on an issue. But even on Brexit, in the end, I compromised, as I remember discussing with you on the Today programme. But day after day after day, I need to look at measures and say, well, I'm just going to support the government. I've got some concerns, for example, about the way protests will be policed. But in the end, I'm going to support the relevant bill.
We'll come to that because it's an interesting test of your commitment to being a liberal. You often call yourself a small L liberal, someone who believes in freedom, what some people call a libertarian. I still want to focus, though, on whether you enjoy this role that you have taken on the backbenches. You see, you're a former RAF officer. We discussed it last time you were on. And some people think you love the whiff of cordite. You've got the smell of the battle in your nose. You can't resist a fight. You see someone and you want to go and punch them.
I'm not a combative person. This is the irony, and people said it to me when I came into politics. I'm an introverted person who doesn't like conflict, but I'm afraid there are some things which I find intolerable, and people keep doing things I find intolerable. And I suppose, it's rage against injustice. And rage against suffering. We look about COVID stuff. It's not an in-principle. The main motivating factor is not just a mere in-principle desire to be free. The main motivating factor is people are suffering terribly from the collateral damage from restrictions on them being able to, for example, see their wife for 50 years in the care home before she died, to recall one story. I mean, so that's the animating force, really, not some mere principle.
We're coming to policy in just a second, but when I said that you like the whiff of cordite, I was struck by the fact that last summer you texted members of the COVID recovery group with a quote from The Great Escape. Yeah. Do you remember what you sent to them?
Yes, it's the duty of every officer to try and escape, wasn't it, that one?
It's the sworn duty of all officers to try to escape. If they cannot escape, it's their sworn duty to cause the enemy to use an inordinate number of troops to guard them, and their sworn duty to harass the enemy to the best of their ability. I just remind you, when you say the enemy, you were talking about people in your own party, in your own government, including their chief scientific advisors and chief medical advisors.
Well, no, Nick,
too.
Look, this is humour, and I know humour's always risky, particularly when it's quoted back to you on an interview. But look, In the Royal Air Force, whenever you went on a operation or an exercise, the kit packing list would always say, bring your sense of humour, because stuff goes wrong, stuff is stressful, you've got to get through difficult circumstances. And I have always believed that when times are at their toughest and most difficult, mobilising and motivating people, keeping the troops going in times of difficulty, requires a sense of humour and a sense of perspective. And that's really what that quote was about.
Is it also that you like not just principle and humour, you're addicted to speed? I wonder if you're an adrenaline junkie. I noticed that in your private time, you like to free fall without a parachute for thousands of feet.
No, I'm a free fall skydiver, yes, but you normally deploy the parachute about 3,000 feet, yeah.
OK. But are you addicted to adrenaline?
Well, I mean, it's difficult for me to say that I'm not because, as you say, I'm a skydiver, I ride fast motorcycles within the law, of course. I previously was a fast catamaran sailor. I suppose what I like to do is big, exciting, dangerous things, but keep the risks under control. That's what I think I find satisfaction in, doing things which are thrilling, but containing the risk and succeeding. And I suppose that's one of the themes of my life. I do like excitement. I get bored quickly, and I like to do thrilling things, you know.
Well, you've had no shortage of excitement in politics in recent years. Let's turn then to philosophy. The COVID rules we'll come to in a second, but you made an overall critique of this government, of this Prime Minister, just before Christmas. You essentially said it's not a Conservative Party anymore, it's heading in the wrong direction, and it's pursuing centre-left policies. How so?
Just the sheer scale of spending and intervention in people's lives. You know, Boris did at one point promise to be a Brexity Hezza after Michael Heseltine, and that really is where he is. He's a power politician. He's led by polls. He likes to promise big, dramatic things and then provide them. That's all very expensive. And I don't think it's quite matches the times that we face, but perhaps you'll ask me about that.
I'll read you the quote. Today's Conservative Party is in the wrong place and heading in the opposite direction of conservatism.
Yes, that's right. That is true. It is heading in the opposite direction. You know, I've always recognised it's a broad church and I'm willing to compromise and build consensus. You mentioned Conservative Way Forward, and people may have seen a clip I put out about that. I'm trying to define a new terrain. We can't reheat conservatism. We need to be much more relational, much more aware of community and people's place in society, in relationship. And so, you know, I'm going to confound people who think we're just reinventing Thatcherism. That's not what we'll do.
So, in other words, you want to combine her love of the free market, her love of freedom, but you recognise the criticism, do you, that says, even if she didn't quite say this, it became popularly felt that she had, that Tories could not say there's no such thing as society.
Yeah, of course, it's a mischaracterisation of her position. But what I would say is that when you look at the Sermon on the Mount, the famously she did, she was very pro-society. But the message really, my message is, and I think she would agree with it, is that relationships are at their best and their most fulfilling and their most healthy and virtuous when they're voluntary. And so what we have to do is think about individuals in relationship and what does it mean to have a good relationship. So, you know, to talk about things like temperance and prudence and, you know, kindness and nobility and magnanimity. You know, the kind of virtues which our society's always been founded on at its best. And that's what conservatism should be about, preserving what's best of society, recognising that good relationships are voluntary, rather than using state power and law to coerce relationships, which is, in the end, that's what the law does. It forces issues, and we need to be much kinder and gentler about what we use the law to do.
Which brings us very neatly onto COVID. What's changed in your attitude to the COVID restrictions? There wasn't a vote on the first lockdown, but I don't think you fought it at the time, but you have fought pretty much every restriction ever since. What did you see? What did you fear? And why did you change your view?
Yes, so I was always very sceptical. But at the beginning, you know, when we were bounced into a lockdown, you know, I remember seeing the announcement during the debate on the Coronavirus Act, which I criticised or expressed great misgivings about. And we were locked down during that debate. And I think we all expected at that time really horrific levels of death and suffering. You know, I had a call with, I forget the exact timing, but at an early stage in this, I had a call with the council. They doubled mortuary capacity and doubled it again. And then we were on the call once again talking about doubling mortuary capacity once more. We expected to run out of crematorium capacity. Muslims in my constituent were worried about being cremated, not buried, but of course the reverse was the concern, that people who wanted to be cremated might have had to be buried just because we had too many bodies to deal with. That was the kind of atmosphere we faced then, and I considered it my duty to take that moderate and supportive tone.
But you went on to talk about panic in government circles. You said that a ghastly trap had been created, a two-tier Britain. Was that simply because your political values, I think also your Christian values, suggest that the state should not have been instructing people in the way that it was, that you were happy if people took their own precautions, but you don't think the government should instruct them, let alone find their behaviour against the law?
Well, I suppose because we are in search of simplicity, I would say that characterisation is broadly correct, but I thought nothing is, of course, simple. The harm principle entitles the state to restrain people's behaviour to protect others, and that is the fundamental legitimacy of the kinds of measures which government used. And many classical liberal commentators today used that argument to justify their support for lockdowns. I think lockdown was most justifiable when the vaccines appeared, and indeed I made sure that we put Sir Jeremy Farrar in front of sceptical MPs at that time so that the best possible case could be made to them by the government's best advocate of that idea. But the point was, lockdown now, reduce the case numbers, get the vaccines into arms, we really will save large numbers of life. That was the best argument they ever had. But if, in a sense, let's put the argument on its head, ask, who really thinks that it is desirable to prevent businesses operating, that it's desirable to prevent people visiting their family in care homes, that it's desirable to prevent you sitting on a park bench or going for a walk with a coffee, or indeed leaving your house for exercise more than once in a day? I really don't think anyone thinks these things are desirable. And I think we're going to find in the inquiry that a large proportion of deaths resulted from infections in care homes and hospitals, not, for example, amongst young people. So it might well be that actually a policy of focused protection might have worked much more successfully without the huge collateral costs of the restrictions that we took. But that remains to be seen.
But many of the scientists I speak to say that the delay to the second lockdown, when the Prime Minister was worried about people like you and your COVID recovery group objecting, cost, they claim, tens of thousands of lives while there was indecision. And they say actually more people died in that period than had died in the first one. Do you accept that what one scientist put to me, that you guys are sometimes interested in politics-led evidence, not evidence-led policy?
No, actually, I would make the same criticism of them. I mean, but let's not. I desperately don't want to have a row here over this, because there is huge uncertainty in all of the, not all of it. The number of people who've died is very certain, but the number of people who've died of COVID rather than with COVID is perhaps less certain. So there's a huge room for debate in all of these things. What I would say is that some scientists were absolutely insisting we had to have a circuit breaker lockdown, but Wales did have one and didn't seem to do very much good. And when I compare, as anyone can, on our world in data, for example, the experience of Germany, the UK and Sweden, it does look rather like it doesn't matter what you do on the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the restrictions of liberty, you get about the same progression of the disease. But I don't wish to be glib, but I would just...
But if you compare Sweden, not locked down, with Denmark, much more like the UK, or if you compare the United States, in many states didn't lock down, with, say, Germany, many scientists say the evidence is absolutely clear. Those restrictions worked.
So I'm absolutely clear in my own mind that if you prevent people from having contact with one another, that will restrict the spread of a disease, yes. Of course, I am clear about that. But the point that I'm making is we can't settle questions of whether non-pharmaceutical interventions are worth the costs that they incur by having a political discussion. And that's why I've brought forward a programme of 4 reforms, one to the Public Health Act, one to the way that cost-benefit analysis is done, which I've brought forward Professor Paul Dolan of the LSE, one on the structure of expert advice. Because actually, I believe I've tried very hard not to be personally critical of experts. I've actually said far too much has been asked of them. Unfair burdens have been placed on their shoulders. And actually, we need to recognise that they're human too and have a better structure of expert advice. And also the modelling needs reforming because it's just been too wrong too often.
I hear you, and you're doing a lot of work on this, but often people hear your colleagues talk. One of them talked about a public health socialist state, for example, and they seem to put freedom as a value above everything else. And yet, you just said a few minutes ago that what conservatism needed to be about was community and not just individual.
At the heart of this debate is this idea about what it means to be a virtuous human being. Because presumably we do want to live in a society of virtue. Well, are we going to keep on terrifying people to comply with, to be obedient to very strict rules? Or are we instead going to be a responsible society which thinks for itself and does the right thing? Now, what I find is time and again people say they want responsibility and they can defend it when it's easy, but once it gets difficult and we might actually learn something and change, they give in and coerce instead. And that's what I'm really opposed to. Let's really make progress here.
I think some people think there's a curiosity that there are people on the Conservative, usually the right of the Conservative Party, who talk a lot about freedom. But, for example, and you raised it, will then give the police huge new powers to limit the power of protests, saying that protests that are too noisy or too inconvenient are not legitimate democratic expressions of opinion. Is there a danger that for Conservatives of your type that you seem interested in one type of freedom and not another type of freedom?
Oh, well, that sort of thing is absolutely the stuff of political debate. You know, I've taken an extremely strident view on COVID status certification of vaccine passports, but I am in favour of voter ID. But I do consider, if we can get into it, if you like, that they're categorically different circumstances. But of course, people equate them and then accuse me of not being principled, and that's on the debate goes. But on protest in particular, when you're talking about people who are willing to disrupt our society by deliberately getting people arrested to flood the courts and bring them to a standstill, you do actually have to stop that. We've got a duty to have the rule of law. I mean, I am not some kind of anarchist. I believe in liberty under the rule of law and right relationships. So we absolutely do have to counter the new radical form of protesting that we have. But if you're asking, am I concerned about some of the stuff on noise, for example, and protest? Yes. And that's why Dominic Grieve and I jointly wrote an article about just that. But in the end, I stood as a Conservative, and the question is yes or no very often. And therefore, you know, sometimes I have to hold my nose. But back to your point, you know, that's where I'm compromising.
And didn't the Conservative Party, didn't people like you have to compromise on this great principle of the size of the state? In other words, many Conservatives would say, look, we were at war, in effect. Of course we had to spend big. Of course we had to borrow. Of course we now have to tax. That's just what you have to do in the equivalent of war. And yet you are concerned that Boris Johnson has, I think, got addicted to the big state.
There's not really any question of having small government in the UK. Not in our lifetimes and not for several generations, if ever. What we could do with is at least balancing the budget. Now, what I believe is happening, the trajectory that we're on, if people look at the Office for Budget Responsibility's Fiscal Sustainability Report, it shows a really genuinely catastrophic trajectory of debt. In the 2018 report, they said, of course, these hundreds of % of GDP debts won't happen, and they said policy will have to change. But when they say policy will have to change, what they mean is the state will default on pensions and healthcare and welfare and education. We'll default. We won't keep our age-related spending obligations unless we work out how to do things differently. And along the way, by the way, I do think we might destroy our currencies as well. Given that that's what I think we face, I'm under a duty, therefore, to tell people and to ask for a change of direction.
There's one other question you face. It's the question lots of people asked you when you appeared on Political Thinking 3 years ago. Will you run to be leader?
No, not now. Because it's a totally implausible idea that any backbencher is going to be catapulted into the last two, past every government minister and the whole cabinet, by Conservative MPs. You might as well ask if I'd like to be a ballerina or an astronaut. It's not going to happen.
Do you know who you will be?
No. I know I'm pretty confident, given my record, that I will be busy during the next leadership election, but I'm not at all certain who for.
And finally, you said it's important to keep a sense of humour in all of this. Doesn't the Conservative Party, doesn't the Tory right in particular, risk looking like those groups in The Life of Brian, the Monty Python film, in which the People's Popular Front of Judea are murdering the Popular Front of Judea while shouting splitters?
Well, you will remember, I think I raised that in relation to the Brexiteers, but no, I don't think so. And I'm so looking forward, Nick, to launching Conservative Way Forward. When you look at the team that I've assembled and the breadth of the party that it covers and the extent of our agreement and the joy of the vision that we're going to present, I am so excited about showing it to you. And all this old nonsense about angry Tory right-wingers will just pale away and fade, and no one will care about it when we do what we are going to do.
Steve Baker, thanks very much for joining me again on Political Thinking.
You're very welcome.
Well, he could hardly have been clearer. It looks like being checkmate for Boris Johnson, he said. The game, though, if it is a game, is very far from over. Not just over the Prime Minister's continued leadership, but perhaps over who follows him and what type of conservatism it involves. What is clear is that one of the key players will be Steve Baker. Thanks for joining me on Political Thinking.